Hello. These are the readings, commentary, little homily for the fourth Sunday of the year. This year, that's January 29th, 2018. The first reading is that one from Deuteronomy that's referred to in the Gospels when people ask John the Baptizer, "Are you the prophet?" The prophet they're talking about is from Deuteronomy chapter 18. Moses spoke to all the people, saying, "A prophet like me will Yahweh your God raise up for you from among your own kin. To him you shall listen. This is exactly what you requested of Yahweh your God at Horeb, on the day of the assembly when you said, 'Let us not again hear the voice of Yahweh our God, nor see this great fire any more, lest we die.' And Yahweh said to me, 'This was well said. I will raise up for them a prophet like you from among their kin, and will put my words into his mouth. He shall tell them all that I commanded him. Whoever will not listen to my words which he speaks in my name, I myself will make him answer for it. But if a prophet presumes to speak in my name, an oracle that I have not commanded him to speak, or speaks in the name of other gods, he shall die.'" The word of the Lord. Not a very happy reading for some people. The second reading is one that we go back to every once in a while when we're talking about celibacy in the church, because this is about the only passage in the Christian scriptures that even refers to it. It's from 1 Corinthians chapter 7. Paul says, "Brothers and sisters, I should like you to be free of anxieties. An unmarried man is anxious about the things of the Lord, how he may please the Lord. But a married man is anxious about the things of the world, how he may please his wife, and he is divided. An unmarried woman or a virgin is anxious about the things of the Lord, so that she may be holy in both body and spirit. A married woman, on the other hand, is anxious about the things of the world, how she may please her husband. I am telling you this for your own benefit, not to impose a restraint upon you, but for the sake of propriety and adherence to the Lord without distraction." The word of the Lord. I always remind people when they bring up the topic, what was Jesus' first miracle? Very often they will simply respond, well, it's very clear, it's changing water into wine at Cana in Galilee. That's John's first miracle. The other three Gospels have other first miracles. And the first miracle, as we'll see in the commentary, in each Gospel is extremely significant because that miracle sets the theme for the rest of the Gospel. In this Gospel, Mark's, in chapter 1, Jesus' first miracle has nothing to do with changing water into wine at Cana in Galilee. They came to Capharnaum, and on the Sabbath Jesus entered the synagogue and taught. The people were astonished at his teaching, for he taught them as one having authority, and not as the scribes. In their synagogue was a man with an unclean spirit. He cried out, "What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." Jesus rebuked him and said, "Quiet, come out of him." The unclean spirit convulsed him, and with a loud cry came out of him. All were amazed and asked one another, "What is this?" A new teaching with authority. He commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him. His fame spread everywhere throughout the whole region of Galilee. The Gospel of the Lord. As I mentioned, this is Mark's first miracle. And as I said, Jesus' first miracle in each gospel sets the theme for that gospel. That's why Jesus in Mark casts out a demon out of this man in the synagogue in Capharnaum. You must understand that demons were regarded as basically the source of evil in people's lives. They were not necessarily moral evil. That's why when Luke talks about Mary Magdalene having had 7 demons, that doesn't mean she was a prostitute. That's totally obnoxious to give her that particular accreditation. It could have been she was sick or something, or as Frank Cleary from St. Louis U frequently would bring up in lectures, a lot of men probably used that woman. That's what created demons in her. But when we talk about a demon, if you are sick, you have a demon. You got the flu in this season. Probably got 2.5 to 3 demons inside of you at least. A demon causes any type of evil. That's why there were all sorts of rules and regulations about how to deal with demons in the ancient world. For instance, you wouldn't be around a person who had a demon, because that demon could jump from that person to you, and then you would have the demon. They would often remind kids demons hang around in dewy grass, so you better not run around at night in dewy grass or you get a demon in you. Or, for instance, we can say they hang around cemeteries, so do your best to stay out of cemeteries. But when Mark has Jesus as his first miracle cast out a demon, what Mark is saying is those who follow Jesus of Nazareth should take on the responsibility of getting rid of evil, as Jesus does in exorcising that demoniac. That's why we have to look at that very seriously. That what do we do in life? What's our role? What are we called to do? If you have a biblical theology, which all the early Christians had, you are called to do your best to get rid of evil. Wherever you find that evil, however you find that evil, get rid of it. If you do that, then you're another Christ. You are basically imitating Jesus, with whom you made a covenant basically to imitate. That's why it's important that we look at this whole concept of evil today. It's rather important, especially in this day and age where you have a lot of fundamentalists siding with certain presidential people, saying, well, I don't really think what he's doing is evil, where you have other people on the other side saying, oh, yes, it is evil. How do you determine what's evil and what isn't evil? I basically learned that you simply follow what the Pope and the bishops and your local pastor and associate tell you. They know what evil is, and if they tell you you have to do this, you do this. That's why even back in the early part of the 20th century, Pius X wrote an encyclical called Vehementer. And in that encyclical, among other things, he said, it's up to the bishops and the priest and the Pope to determine what we should be doing. It's up to the laity just to follow what those other people tell us to do. So if you are a Catholic, in the old time definition of Catholic, all you do is find out what evil is by checking with the priest. I hate to tell you, that's not what early Christians did. After all, there were no priests anywhere, as we know priests today, for the first couple of centuries. We have to realize that basically you depended to find out what is evil, what you should be doing, on prophets. That's why the people are so uptight when Moses is about to kick off in Deuteronomy in today's first reading, because he is the prophet par excellence, and they're afraid when he dies, that's the end of finding out what God wants us to do. We'll be wandering around like blind people with no one to guide us. When Moses then reminds the people that Yahweh will send another prophet, he's not talking about just one specific individual. He's basically saying he will send other people in the community who will tell you what is God's will. There are two classic definitions of prophets. You have the one by Bruce Vaughter years ago, which said the prophet is the conscience of the community. The prophet is the one who is always in our life telling us what our consciences should tell us that God wishes us to do. You have another definition by the great Hans Walter Wolff, one of my professors years ago, who said the prophet is the person in the community who gives you the future implications of your present actions. The prophet is the person in the community who gives you the future implications of your present actions. What you're doing now might not create much of a problem for you. 5 years down the road, it can have implications that you'd rather not even bring up or discuss. And the prophet is the person who does this. Well, we have to realize, because prophets in Scripture are the normal method of finding out the will of God, that people in authority had ways to beat that particular system. They, for instance, would hire prophets at all the shrines, people who would tell you what God wished you to do or Yahweh expected you to carry out when you made your yearly or monthly visit to one of the shrines. The difficulty is, these guys, as the scriptures say, ate at the priest's table, which meant they were on the payroll of the priest. You basically found out what the priest wanted when one of these fake prophets gave you a prophecy. You had court prophets, people who the king hired to give advice to individuals and even to himself, but they also ate at the king's table. And so you really had to determine who's a real prophet, who's a fake prophet, before you could even begin to find out what the will of God is. That's why there are 5, I hold because of Hans Walter Wolf, 6 ways of telling real prophets from fake prophets. Rule number 1, a real prophet always takes you back to the beginning. A real prophet always goes back, as in Judaism, always goes back to the Exodus, goes back to what Yahweh does on Mount Sinai, even goes further back than then, how Yahweh related to Abraham and Sarah. Real prophets really always go back to those beginnings, just like Christian prophets always have to go back to Jesus of Nazareth and his death and resurrection. What does Jesus of Nazareth expect of us somehow or another? Secondly, real prophets cannot profit from prophecy, which means you can't make a living off of being a prophet. You can take all these guys, most of those guys at least on Sunday morning, these televangelists, and just wipe them off the prophetic paper. All of them make a fortune off of what they're doing. Real prophets could never prophesy from prophecy. Who would you pay to be your conscience? You want to avoid that conscience, not pay him. Thirdly, real prophets not only can't make a living from prophecy, they suffer from prophecy. That's why it's so difficult sometimes for us to really understand real prophecy, because real prophets are not necessarily very strong-willed people in that sense. They're not people who live high on the hog. They're people who you find very difficult to surface because they're frequently suffering for what they do. Rule number 4. If you follow a real prophet, you also will suffer. That's why a lot of people don't particularly care to follow what prophets say. They'd rather listen to these televangelists who constantly preach a prosperity gospel. Where they get that prosperity gospel, I don't know what Bible they're reading. I certainly don't read it in there except some passages they take out of context. Rule number 5. Down deep, all of us really know who the real prophets are in our life. We basically know who we should be listening to, who we should be following through on in what God wishes us to do. But because of rule number 4, that real prophets suffer and you would have to suffer with them, we don't like to admit what a real prophet is because we don't like the suffering that entails. I mentioned that I, as a student of Hans Walter Wolf, also give a 6th way of telling real prophets from fake prophets. Wolf used to constantly remind us, real prophets confuse people. Fake prophets never confuse you. Fake prophets say, just keep doing what you're doing. What you learned in grade school that God wanted you to do, just do even when you're 60 years old. There's nothing that you have to learn that you didn't learn in 2nd grade when you made your first confession. Real prophets confuse people because you have to realize real prophets ask you to convert, to go through a metanoia. And whenever we change, there's always the questions about, what did I do in the past? Is this the right way or is that the right way? Wolf said, if you're not confused, the person is not a real prophet. Now, one last thing, and I realize this is going a little bit longer than most of my videos. When we take that second reading from 1 Corinthians about Paul's advice not to get married. Please, Paul's advice not to get married today, I think, would really be challenged. Paul was writing this from a totally different perspective. He thought the risen Jesus was returning in that parousia, that second coming, in a very short period of time. He was not condemning somebody to a life of not getting married. He therefore, I think, would look at it, as he said in there, he doesn't want to put this, in Greek it says, as a noose around anybody's neck. He wouldn't say you have to follow celibacy just because I said something about it. Sometimes prophets have to change according to the custom or according to the day and age and the perspective from which they're doing their prophesying. That's why also you have to be careful when you try to find out who the real prophets are. Rarely, as Carol Stuhmiller used to remind us, are people who are administrators prophets. That's a lucky strike extra if you get an administrator who's also a prophet. As Paul says, administration is one gift, prophecy is another gift of the Spirit. You don't usually have both those gifts settled into one individual. I always remember one of the scenes from the movie, the Spielberg movie, Lincoln. Remember, Lincoln gets Thaddeus Stevens down in the basement of the White House one night during a party. And he wants Stevens to change his tone of voice about getting rid of slavery for the House of Representatives so he can have a constitutional amendment passed. Lincoln does. And he then says, you know, what you are saying is correct. We should get rid of slavery. But he says, you know, I used to be a surveyor, Lincoln says. And even though I would use a compass, for instance, and that compass always points due north, no matter what, that's solid, that's north. That compass doesn't tell you there's a, swamp between here and there. There's a cliff between here and north. You might have to go a little bit left or right before you can go north again. In a way, Lincoln was saying that administrators are the ones who help prophets carry out their ministry. Stuhmiller used to always say, don't elect a prophet as a bishop, please. They make lousy administrators. Just like administrators very frequently make lousy prophets. We have to realize what these gifts of the Spirit are. We have to realize that that has never been replaced, that prophets are the basic way of understanding God's will. Not papal documents, not an institution. It's these strange guys in the community who we surface, who somehow or another, these strange men and women basically point us in the right direction. We might need the administrators to tell us how to get to that particular goal, but we need to know at least what direction in which to go. That's why today when we walk out of church, if we go to church, we're going to start looking around us and saying, who are the prophets in our midst? I have told this story ad nauseum. One time I interviewed Carol Stuhmiller for a radio program that Jack Frecker and I had, and it was on prophecy. And during one of the breaks, I asked him, I says, Carol, who are the prophets, in our lifetime? And he brought up Martin Luther King, Mahatma Gandhi, people who we normally would think as prophets. Then he said, Raj, I have my own personal list of prophets that I don't share with anybody, not even you, who are my friend. He said, because if it ever got out who I thought the prophets in my life actually are, I'd never be welcome in another Catholic pulpit the rest of my life. Please, today would be a good day to come home, sit down, and make a list just of 3 or 4 people who you think are the conscience of the community, or at least the conscience in your life, or again, following Wolf, who are the people who really deliver the future implications of our present actions. If we have to eradicate evil, it's very important that we find out what that evil is. And if we don't surface prophets, I guarantee you, we're not going to ever find out what Mark's Jesus expects us to do. Thank you.